My name is Emma Collins, and the moment my sister Jessica pointed at my purchase and declared it worthless garage sale trash in front of 200 people, I knew our relationship would never be the same. The auction paddle trembled slightly in my hand as laughter rippled through the crowd at Riverside Auction House. Jessica stood there in her tailored navy blazer, perfectly styled blonde hair catching the afternoon light streaming through the tall windows, surrounded by her real estate colleagues who hung on every word she spoke. She had that same confident smirk she'd worn since we were children, the one that said she knew exactly how the world worked and where everyone belonged in it. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I clutched the small canvas bag containing my documentation, feeling the weight of 6 months of research, authentication, and quiet determination. The ornate silver tea service sat on the display table before us, tarnished and unremarkable to most eyes, exactly the kind of piece Jessica would dismiss without a second thought. But I had spent countless hours with magnifying glasses and reference books, traced its lineage through auction records and estate documents, even traveled to Boston to have it examined by specialists. What everyone saw as junk, I knew to be something extraordinary. Jessica's voice carried across the room as she gestured dramatically toward my winning bid. Can you believe my sister just spent $800 on that old thing? Emma's always had this obsession with dusty antiques, but this might be her biggest waste of money yet. Her colleagues chuckled politely, and I felt the familiar sting of being reduced to a punchline in someone else's story. But then Robert Martinez, the auction house owner, approached our section with a curious expression on his weathered face. "Excuse me," he said, his voice carrying the authority of 4 decades in the antique business. "Did you say Collins? Are you Emma Collins from Collins & Chen Appraisals?" The question hung in the air like smoke, and suddenly Jessica's confident expression flickered with uncertainty. I nodded quietly, reaching into my bag for the document that would change everything. "Ladies and gentlemen," Robert announced to the crowd, his voice rising above the murmur of conversations, "we have someone very special with us today. Miss Collins, would you mind sharing what you've discovered about this piece?" Growing up in the Collins household meant understanding early that success came in only one flavor, and it tasted like straight A's, varsity letters, and the kind of ambition that looked good on college applications. Jessica, my younger sister by 3 years, seemed to absorb this lesson through her skin, excelling at everything that mattered to our parents. She was student body treasurer, captain of the debate team, and had a smile that could convince anyone she belonged wherever she decided to stand. Our mother Margaret, a retired high school English teacher, would beam with pride whenever Jessica's achievements were announced at school assemblies, while our father Frank, who had spent 30 years climbing the ladder at Cedar Falls National Bank, saw in Jessica the kind of drive he understood and respected. I was the daughter who spent Saturday mornings at garage sales instead of soccer practice, who preferred dusty antique shops to shopping malls, and who could tell you the difference between Depression glass and Carnival glass, but couldn't explain why that knowledge mattered to anyone else. While Jessica collected trophies and academic awards, I collected stories about the objects other people discarded, fascinated by the history embedded in a chipped teacup or the craftsmanship hidden beneath layers of tarnish on an old silver spoon. Our parents weren't cruel, just bewildered by my interests. When I brought home a Victorian music box I'd restored, my mother would pat my head and suggest I focus more on my grades. When I explained the significance of a particular pottery mark I'd discovered, my father would nod politely and change the subject to Jessica's latest achievement. They loved me, but they didn't understand me, and in a family where understanding seemed to equal value, I learned to shrink into the background. The pattern became more pronounced as we grew older. Jessica's high school graduation party filled our backyard with friends, teachers, and family members celebrating her full scholarship to a prestigious business college. My own graduation, while academically respectable, was marked by a quiet dinner and my mother's gentle suggestion that I consider something more practical than art history for my college major. "Antiques are a lovely hobby, dear," she had said, "but you need to think about making a living. Jessica flourished in college, majoring in business administration with a minor in marketing, joining sororities and networking groups that would serve her well in her future career. She sent home photos of herself at formal events, internship announcements, and Dean's List certificates that our parents proudly displayed on the refrigerator. Meanwhile, I pursued my art history degree at the State University, spending hours in the library researching decorative arts movements and learning to authenticate period pieces. My professors recognized my passion and skill, but my family remained politely uninterested in my academic achievements. The divide deepened after college when Jessica launched immediately into a successful real estate career, while I struggled to find my footing in the antique world. She moved into a sleek downtown apartment and drove a leased BMW, attending networking events and closing deals that earned her recognition as the office's rising star. I took a part-time job at a local antique store, learning the business from the ground up while living in a tiny apartment above a used bookstore. When we gathered for family dinners, Jessica would regale everyone with stories of million-dollar listings and satisfied clients, while I quietly listened from the sidelines. Our parents' response to our different paths was telling. Jessica's success earned praise, pride, and endless questions about her latest achievements. My growing expertise in antique appraisal was met with polite interest and the occasional suggestion that I might want to get my real estate license like Jessica. "The antique thing is nice," my father would say, "but Jessica's really building something substantial." The comments stung not because they were malicious, but because they revealed how little my family understood about what I was building. While they saw Jessica's visible success, they missed the quiet reputation I was developing among serious collectors and dealers. They didn't know about the authentication work I was doing for auction houses, the research papers I was publishing in trade journals, or the network of experts who respected my eye for quality and historical significance. By the time I turned 28, I had partnered with David Chen, a fellow appraiser whose expertise in Asian art complemented my knowledge of American and European pieces. We opened Collins and Chen appraisals in a modest office above the bookstore where I lived, offering authentication and valuation services to collectors, estate attorneys, and auction houses. The business grew slowly but steadily, built on referrals and a reputation for thoroughness and accuracy. Jessica, now 31 and one.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Of the top agents at Premier Properties Real Estate had purchased a beautiful colonial house in Cedar Falls' most desirable neighborhood. She drove a new Audi, vacationed in Europe, and was featured in the local business journal as one of the area's 30 under 30 rising stars. At family gatherings, she would show photos of her latest closings and talk about her plans to open her own real estate firm. The contrast between our lives was stark and to our family clearly defined. Jessica was the success story, the daughter who had fulfilled their expectations and exceeded their dreams. I was the dreamer who had turned her hobby into a modest living, respectable but unremarkable. This perception shaped every interaction we had, every family dinner, every holiday gathering where Jessica's achievements were celebrated while my work was politely acknowledged and quickly moved past. The irony was that I had found my passion and was building something meaningful, but in a world that valued flash over substance, visible success over quiet expertise. Jessica's achievements were easy to understand and measure, while mine required a deeper knowledge of markets and history that our family didn't possess. I didn't resent Jessica's success, but I was tired of being seen as the sister who had settled for less, who had chosen a path that seemed smaller and less ambitious than what I was capable of achieving. This dynamic had persisted for years, so ingrained in our family structure that I had stopped expecting it to change. Jessica was the star, I was the supporting character, and everyone seemed comfortable with these roles. Until the day I walked into a garage sale in an upscale neighborhood and spotted something that would challenge everything my family thought they knew about success, value, and the difference between what something appears to be and what it actually is. The garage sale was in Willowbrook Estates, Cedar Falls' most exclusive neighborhood, where Jessica had actually sold several properties over the years. I almost didn't stop, driving past twice before curiosity got the better of me. The sale was clearly winding down, with most of the good pieces already claimed and only the odds and ends remaining. Tables were half empty, and the elderly woman running the sale looked tired and ready to pack up whatever didn't sell. That's when I saw it, sitting on a card table between a stack of old magazines and a collection of mismatched coffee mugs. The silver tea service was tarnished almost black, the intricate engravings obscured by decades of neglect. To most people, it would have looked like exactly what the price tag suggested, old silver plate worth maybe $15 to someone who wanted to polish it up for decoration. But something about the weight of the pieces, the quality of the craftsmanship visible beneath the tarnish, made me look closer. I picked up the teapot carefully, feeling the substantial heft that suggested solid silver rather than plate. The maker's marks were barely visible under the tarnish, but I could make out enough to know this wasn't mass-produced silverware. The style suggested late 18th or early 19th century American work, and the proportions were exactly right for the period. I examined each piece in the set, the teapot, sugar bowl, creamer and waste bowl, noting the consistent quality and the way the handles were attached with the kind of precision that spoke to master craftsmanship. "Are you interested in that old tea set?" the woman asked, approaching with a tired smile. "It belonged to my great-aunt. I've been meaning to polish it up, but I just don't have the time anymore." I nodded, trying to keep my expression neutral while my heart raced with possibility. "It's lovely. Do you know anything about its history?" She shrugged apologetically. "Not really, it's been in the family forever, but I don't know much about antiques. My great-aunt lived in Boston her whole life, came from some old family there. That's about all I can tell you. Boston, old family." The pieces were clicking together in my mind, but I didn't dare hope until I could research properly. "Would you take 15 for the set?" I asked, pointing to the price tag. "Of course, dear. I'm just happy it's going to someone who appreciates old things." I paid for the tea service and carefully loaded it into my car, my hands shaking slightly with excitement and the weight of possibility. The next 6 months would be consumed with research, authentication, and the slow, methodical process of uncovering the truth about what I had found. I photographed every mark, every detail, and began the painstaking work of tracing the set's provenance through auction records, estate inventories, and historical documents. The breakthrough came when I identified the maker's mark as belonging to Paul Revere Jr., the famous patriot, whose silver work was among the most prized in American decorative arts. But identification was only the beginning. Authentication required documentation, provenance, and expert verification. I spent weeks at the Boston Public Library, tracing the family history of my seller's great-aunt, finding records that connected her lineage to one of Revere's documented commissions. I contacted Sotheby's authentication department, providing detailed photographs and documentation for their review. The process took months, but when the official appraisal certificate arrived, it confirmed what I had hoped but hardly dared believe. The tea service was authentic Paul Revere silver, circa 1785, with clear provenance and an estimated auction value of $75,000 to $100,000. I had turned a $15 garage sale purchase into a discovery worth more than Jessica's annual income, but I told no one in my family about it. This wasn't about proving anything to them, it was about the pure joy of discovery, the satisfaction of recognizing something extraordinary that everyone else had overlooked. I planned to quietly sell the piece through a reputable auction house and use the proceeds to expand my business, maybe finally rent a proper storefront instead of working above the bookstore. But fate had other plans. The Cedar Falls Historical Society announced their annual charity auction, featuring estate donations from prominent local families. It was one of the social events of the year, attended by everyone who considered themselves part of the community's cultural elite. Jessica, as one of the area's successful business owners, would certainly be there with her colleagues. And I realized this auction would be the perfect venue to sell the Revere tea service, not for the money, but for the validation it would provide for everything I had built in the shadows while Jessica basked in the spotlight. I consigned the piece to the auction, providing Robert Martinez with the full documentation and authentication certificates. He was stunned by the discovery and agreed that the annual charity auction would be the ideal venue for such a significant piece. The tea service would be one of the evening's featured lots, estimated to bring between $75,000 and $100,000 for the Historical Society's Preservation Fund. I didn't tell my family about the consignment, didn't mention that I would be attending the auction as anything more than a casual observer. This would be my moment, not to gloat or seek revenge, but to finally step out of the shadows and show everyone who had overlooked me exactly what I was capable of achieving. The girl who collected old junk was about to prove that sometimes the most extraordinary treasures are hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone with the knowledge and passion to recognize their true value. The silence that followed Robert Martinez's announcement stretched like a held breath across the entire auction hall. 200 faces turned toward me with expressions ranging from curiosity to confusion, while Jessica's confident smile froze into something resembling a mask. Her real estate colleagues shifted uncomfortably, suddenly uncertain about the woman they had just been laughing with. The afternoon sunlight streaming through the tall windows seemed to spotlight the moment, casting long shadows across the polished wooden floors of Riverside Auction House. I reached into my canvas bag with steady hands, feeling the weight of the official documentation that would transform this moment from embarrassment into vindication. The Sotheby's authentication certificate was pristine in its protective sleeve, bearing the letterhead and seal that carried more authority in the antique world than any business card or sales award Jessica had ever earned. 6 months of research, 3 expert consultations, and countless hours of meticulous documentation had led to this single piece of paper that would rewrite everything my family thought they knew about value and success. Robert's weathered face showed genuine respect as he gestured toward the tea service on the display table. Miss Collins has been one of the region's most respected appraisers for several years now. When she contacted us about this piece, we knew we were dealing with something extraordinary. His voice carried the weight of 4 decades in the business, and every serious collector in the room understood the significance of his endorsement. Jessica's face had gone pale beneath her carefully applied makeup, her earlier confidence crumbling as she began to understand that the sister she had just publicly dismissed might know something she didn't. The tea service sat under the auction house lights, no longer looking like the tarnished junk Jessica had mocked but somehow transformed by the context of expert recognition. The silver gleamed where I had carefully cleaned small test areas to reveal the metal beneath the patina, and the intricate engravings that spoke to 18th-century craftsmanship were now visible to anyone who knew how to look. What had been invisible to the casual observer was suddenly obvious under the scrutiny of people who understood quality and historical significance. "Would you mind sharing your discovery with everyone?" Robert asked, his tone respectful but encouraging. The question hung in the air like an invitation to step fully into the light, to claim the expertise I had been building in silence while my family celebrated Jessica's more visible achievements. I nodded, unfolding the authentication certificate with the same careful precision I brought to every aspect of my work. "This tea service," I began, my voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment, "was crafted by Paul Revere Jr. in approximately 1785. The maker's marks, the construction techniques, and the stylistic elements all point to his workshop during the height of his silversmithing career." A murmur ran through the crowd as the significance of the name registered. Paul Revere wasn't just a patriot who rode through the night warning of British troops, he was one of America's most celebrated silversmiths, whose work now commanded astronomical prices at major auction houses. Jessica's mouth opened slightly, then closed again as she struggled to process what she was hearing. The sister she had just dismissed as a dreamer who wasted money on garage sale finds was standing before 200 people, including some of the region's most serious collectors, explaining the historical significance of what she had originally called old junk. The reversal was so complete, so unexpected, that she seemed unable to formulate any response at all. Robert nodded approvingly as I continued my explanation. "The provenance has been thoroughly documented through estate records and family genealogies. The piece was commissioned by the Hartwell family of Boston, and remained in their possession until it was sold at a recent estate dispersal." I didn't mention that the estate dispersal had been a garage sale where the seller hadn't understood what she owned, or that I had paid $15 for something now estimated to be worth nearly $100,000. Those details would come later, in the private conversation Jessica and I would inevitably have once the shock wore off. The crowd was completely focused now, recognizing that they were witnessing something rare in the auction world, the discovery of a truly significant piece that had been hidden in plain sight. These were people who understood the thrill of finding extraordinary objects in unexpected places, and my story resonated with every collector's dream of uncovering buried treasure. Jessica, however, looked like she wanted to disappear into the polished wooden floor. The authentication process involved consultation with 3 independent experts, including specialists at Sotheby's and the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, I continued, holding up the official certificate that made my claims irrefutable. The estimated auction value is between $75,000 and $100,000, with proceeds going to support the Cedar Falls Historical Society's preservation efforts. The numbers hung in the air like a challenge to everything Jessica had assumed about my life, my choices, and my understanding of value. Robert smiled broadly, clearly delighted by the drama unfolding in his auction house. Ladies and gentlemen, this is exactly the kind of discovery that makes our work exciting. Miss Collins represents the best of what serious collecting and scholarship can achieve. His endorsement carried weight with everyone in the room, establishing my credibility beyond any doubt, while simultaneously highlighting Jessica's earlier dismissal as the uninformed commentary it had been. The applause that followed was different from the casual laughter that had greeted Jessica's mockery. This was respectful recognition from people who understood expertise when they saw it, acknowledgement from a community that valued knowledge and passionate dedication to craft. I had waited years for this kind of validation, not from my family but from the world where my work actually mattered. The fact that Jessica was witnessing it made the moment more complex, but no less satisfying. As the crowd began to disperse, preparing for the actual auction to begin, I saw Jessica's colleagues exchanging glances that spoke volumes about their reassessment of the Collins family dynamics. Lisa Thompson, who had been one of the loudest laughers at Jessica's joke, now looked embarrassed by her earlier participation in what she was beginning to understand had been a profound misjudgment. The social dynamics that had seemed so clear moments earlier were shifting as people recalibrated their understanding of who held real expertise in this room. Growing up as the Collins family's quiet daughter had taught me to find satisfaction in small victories, in moments of recognition that came without fanfare or celebration. My childhood was spent in the shadows of Jessica's bright achievements, learning to value the approval of antique dealers and historians over the praise of parents who didn't understand what I was building. This pattern had been established so early that I barely remembered a time when I expected equal recognition for my accomplishments. Our house on Maple Street was a shrine to Jessica's success from the moment she started bringing home perfect report cards and leadership awards. The refrigerator door displayed her certificates and newspaper clippings, while my own achievements were acknowledged with polite nods and gentle suggestions that I broaden my interests. When I won the state competition for historical research in high school, researching the decorative arts of colonial Connecticut, my parents attended the awards ceremony, but spent the drive home discussing Jessica's upcoming prom and her campaign for senior class treasurer. The message was clear without ever being explicitly stated: Jessica's path was the one that mattered, the one that led to real success and recognition. My fascination with antiques was indulged as a harmless hobby, something that would eventually give way to more practical concerns like career and marriage. When I announced my intention to major in art history with a focus on American decorative arts, my father suggested I consider a double major in education so I would have something to fall back on. College deepened the divide between Jessica's obvious success and my more esoteric pursuits. She sent home photos from networking events and internships with prestigious firms, while I spent weekends visiting museums and auction houses, building relationships with dealers and collectors who appreciated my growing expertise. My professors recognized my talent for authentication and historical research, but my family remained focused on Jessica's more visible achievements. The pattern continued after graduation when Jessica launched immediately into real estate success, while I struggled to establish myself in the antique world. Her achievements were measurable and impressive: sales figures, awards, recognition from industry organizations. My work was harder to quantify, built on relationships with collectors and dealers who valued expertise over flash, reputation over marketing. When Jessica bought her first new car, my parents celebrated with a dinner party. When I published my first authentication study in a respected trade journal, they offered polite congratulations and changed the subject. Family gatherings became exercises in patient endurance as Jessica's latest triumphs were dissected and celebrated while my work was politely acknowledged and quickly passed over. I learned to smile and nod when relatives asked if I was still doing the antique thing, as if my growing expertise was a phase I might eventually outgrow. The assumption seemed to be that I was marking time until I found something more substantial to do with my life, something that resembled the kind of success Jessica had achieved. The irony was that I was building something substantial, just not in a way my family could easily understand or measure. My partnership with David Chen was growing steadily, built on referrals from satisfied clients and recognition from auction houses who trusted our expertise. We were developing a reputation for thorough research and accurate authentication that extended far beyond Cedar Falls, but this success was largely invisible to people who measured achievement in terms of office size and annual income. By my late 20s, I had stopped expecting my family to understand or value what I was doing. I found satisfaction in the work itself, in the moment of recognition when I identified a significant piece, in the respect of dealers and collectors who understood the depth of knowledge required for accurate authentication. The Paul Revere tea service represented the culmination of everything I had been building toward, but I had planned to sell it quietly through a major auction house in New York, using the proceeds to expand my business without fanfare or family drama. The decision to consign the piece to the Cedar Falls charity auction was impulsive, driven by a sudden desire to step out of the shadows where I had been working for so many years. I was tired of being the Collins daughter who had settled for less, whose achievements were invisible to the people who mattered most to me. The charity auction would give me a platform to demonstrate my expertise in front of everyone who had ever dismissed my work as a harmless hobby. I knew Jessica would be there with her real estate colleagues, knew she would see the tea service and probably make some dismissive comment about my latest junk shop find. I had played out variations of this scenario in my mind, imagining her surprise when the piece sold for far more than she thought possible. But I hadn't anticipated the public mockery, the casual cruelty of her assumption that I didn't belong in a room full of serious collectors and dealers. The moment when she pointed at my purchase and declared it worthless garage sale trash crystallized years of accumulated frustration and hurt. This wasn't just about one misidentified antique, it was about a lifetime of being underestimated, overlooked, and gently dismissed by people who never bothered to understand what I was actually doing. Jessica's laughter represented everything I had been fighting against, the assumption that visible success was the only success that mattered. But now, standing in the auction house with Robert Martinez's respectful introduction still echoing in my ears, I realized that this moment was bigger than family dynamics or sibling rivalry. This was about the difference between appearance and reality, between surface-level judgments and deeper understanding. The people in this room understood that value wasn't always obvious, that expertise required patience and dedication, that the most significant discoveries often came from looking more carefully at things others had dismissed. The tea service sat on the display table like a metaphor for everything I had been trying to prove. To casual observers, it was tarnished and unremarkable, the kind of thing people sold at garage sales when they were clearing out accumulated possessions. But to someone with the knowledge and passion to look deeper, it was a masterpiece of American craftsmanship, a piece of history that connected us to the colonial period, and one of our nation's most celebrated artisans. Jessica's reaction to my authentication was still unfolding, her confident expression replaced by something approaching shock as she began to understand the magnitude of her miscalculation. The colleagues who had laughed at her joke were now looking at her with a mixture of embarrassment and curiosity, wondering how she had so completely misread the situation. The social dynamics that had seemed clear moments earlier were shifting as people recalibrated their understanding of the Collins family hierarchy. I felt no satisfaction in Jessica's discomfort, only a quiet relief that the truth was finally visible to everyone who had ever questioned my choices or my expertise. This wasn't about revenge or proving Jessica wrong, it was about claiming the recognition I had earned through years of dedicated study and careful work. The authentication certificate in my hands represented more than just the value of one antique. It was validation of everything I had been building, while others focused on more obvious forms of success. The auction was about to begin, and the tea service would soon command the attention and respect it deserved. But more importantly, I had finally stepped out of the shadows where I had been working for so many years, claiming my place among the experts and collectors who understood the value of what I did. The girl who had been dismissed as a dreamer with an expensive hobby had just proven that sometimes the deepest knowledge comes from the most unexpected places. The summer I turned 18 and Jessica 15 marked the moment our divergent paths became impossible to ignore. Jessica had just finished her sophomore year as student body vice president, star of the debate team and recipient of the Principal's Award for Academic Excellence. Her bedroom walls were covered with certificates, ribbons, and photographs from various school events where she stood at podiums or posed with trophies. She moved through the world with the kind of confidence that comes from constant validation, each success building upon the last until achievement seemed as natural to her as breathing. I spent that same summer working at Thornfield Antiques, a cluttered shop downtown run by Eleanor Hartley, a 70-year-old woman who had been dealing in estate pieces for 4 decades. Eleanor was the first person who ever looked at my interest in old objects as something valuable rather than merely charming. She taught me to read maker's marks through a jeweler's lupo, to identify different types of wood by their grain patterns and to spot the subtle signs that separated authentic period pieces from clever reproductions. The work at Thornfield paid minimum wage, but Eleanor supplemented my education with knowledge worth far more than money. She would pull pieces from the back room and quiz me on their origins, teaching me to look beyond surface appearance to understand construction techniques, historical context, and artistic movement. "Anyone can see what something looks like," she would say, holding up a seemingly ordinary ceramic bowl. "But can you see what it means? Can you understand the story it tells about the people who made it and the world they lived in?" While Jessica attended cheerleading camp and academic enrichment programs that would strengthen her college applications, I spent my days learning to authenticate Depression-era glassware and identify the subtle differences between genuine Chippendale furniture and 19th-century reproductions. Eleanor treated my questions with the same seriousness she brought to conversations with collectors who spent thousands of dollars on single pieces. She never suggested that I was wasting my time or that I should be focusing on more practical pursuits. My parents, however, viewed my summer job with gentle bewilderment. They were proud that I was working and earning money, but they couldn't understand why I had chosen an antique shop over the retail positions at the mall where many of my classmates were employed. "It's wonderful that Emma is so responsible," my mother would tell her friends, though I wish she would show more interest in things that might help her in college. The implication was always that my fascination with antiques was a pleasant diversion that would eventually give way to more serious concerns. The contrast became more pronounced when Jessica's debate team won the state championship and local newspapers ran photos of her accepting the trophy. Our parents framed the article and displayed it prominently in the living room, where visitors could admire Jessica's moment of triumph. That same week, I correctly identified a piece of rookwood pottery that Eleanor had been unsure about, research that led to a sale worth 3 times what the shop had paid for it. But my contribution to Eleanor's business success wasn't the kind of achievement that made headlines or earned display space in our family home. Eleanor began taking me to estate sales and auctions, teaching me to spot quality pieces among the accumulated possessions of families who often didn't understand what they were selling. I learned to maintain a neutral expression when examining potentially valuable items, to avoid revealing my excitement until after negotiations were complete. The thrill of discovery became addictive, the moment when careful observation and research knowledge combined to reveal hidden treasure among objects others had dismissed as ordinary household goods. One particular Saturday in late July, Eleanor and I attended an estate sale in Millbrook, a wealthy neighborhood where old families were selling the accumulated possessions of multiple generations. The house was filled with the kind of formal furniture and decorative objects that spoke to inherited wealth and refined taste. Most of the serious dealers had already combed through the obvious valuable pieces, leaving behind items that seemed less significant to casual observers. I was examining a collection of silver-plated serving pieces when something caught my eye in a corner cabinet that had been largely overlooked. Tucked behind some unremarkable china was a small porcelain figurine that looked different from the mass-produced collectibles surrounding it. The modeling was more sophisticated, the glazework more refined, and the base bore markings that I couldn't quite make out in the dim light of the cabinet. Eleanor watched as I carefully extracted the piece and examined it under better lighting. The figurine depicted a young woman in 18th-century dress, but the artistic quality was far superior to the decorative objects typically found at estate sales. The porcelain had the creamy translucence that spoke to high-quality European manufacture, and the painting was executed with the kind of precise detail that suggested individual artistry rather than factory production. "What do you think?" Eleanor asked quietly, recognizing the focused attention I brought to pieces that might be significant. I turned the figurine over to examine the base markings more carefully. The symbols were partially obscured by age and handling, but I could make out enough to suggest German origin, possibly from one of the prestigious Meissen workshops. "I think it might be more than it appears," I said carefully, not wanting to commit to an opinion without more research. Eleanor negotiated the purchase of several items including the figurine, which was priced at $25, along with some other decorative pieces the family was eager to sell as a lot. Back at the shop, I spent hours researching the markings and comparing the figurine to reference materials Eleanor kept in her extensive library of collector's guides and auction catalogs. The breakthrough came when I found a match in a catalog from a recent Sotheby's auction. The figurine was indeed Meissen, crafted around 1750 and part of a limited series commissioned for European nobility. Similar pieces had sold at major auction houses for anywhere from $8,000 to $12,000, depending on condition and provenance. Eleanor's $25 purchase had yielded a discovery worth hundreds of times that amount. Eleanor was delighted but not surprised by my identification. "This is exactly why serious collecting requires education and patience," she said. "Anyone can buy expensive pieces from established dealers, but finding quality in unexpected places requires knowledge that most people don't possess." She split the eventual profit from the figurine's sale with me, recognizing that my research and identification had made the discovery possible. When I tried to share my excitement about the Meissen figurine with my family, their response was politely interested but ultimately dismissive. "That's wonderful, dear," my mother said. "It's so nice that Eleanor appreciates your help." The implication was that my contribution had been assistance rather than expertise, that Eleanor deserved credit for the discovery while I had simply provided support. My father nodded approvingly and mentioned that the money I had earned would be useful for college expenses, reducing my achievement to its most practical dimension. Jessica, meanwhile, was preparing for her junior year with the kind of ambitious planning that would ensure continued success. She had mapped out her course schedule to maximize her GPA while participating in activities that would strengthen her college applications. Her summer had been spent at academic camps and leadership conferences that would provide material for compelling personal essays. Every decision was strategic, designed to build toward the kind of comprehensive achievement that college admissions officers would find irresistible. The difference in how our parents responded to our respective accomplishments was subtle but unmistakable. Jessica's achievements were celebrated as evidence of her bright future, while mine were acknowledged as pleasant surprises that might prove useful in some vague way. Jessica was building something important that everyone could understand and appreciate, while I was pursuing interests that seemed charming but ultimately peripheral to real success. Senior year intensified these patterns as Jessica's college application process became a family project involving research, campus visits, and careful strategizing about how to present her achievements most effectively. She applied to prestigious business programs at universities that would open doors to careers in finance, consulting, and corporate management. Her guidance counselor spoke enthusiastically about her potential for leadership and her obvious preparation for success in competitive professional environments. My own college planning was more solitary and less celebrated. I knew I wanted to study art history with a focus on American decorative arts, but this choice was met with gentle concern rather than enthusiasm. Art history is certainly interesting, my guidance counselor said, but have you considered what you might do with that degree? Perhaps you could minor in business or education to keep your options open. The assumption was that my academic interests were too specialized to lead to viable career prospects. I applied to schools with strong art history programs and professors who specialized in American material culture. My personal essay described my work at Thornfield Antiques and my growing expertise in authentication and historical research. I wrote about the thrill of discovering the Meissen figurine and how that experience had convinced me that objects could tell stories about the past in ways that traditional historical documents couldn't capture. The responses to our college applications reflected our family's different expectations for our futures. Jessica was accepted to several prestigious business programs and received scholarship offers that our parents proudly shared with relatives and family friends. Her success was seen as validation of years of careful planning and hard work, proof that she was destined for the kind of achievement everyone understood and respected. My acceptance to the State University's art history program was met with relief rather than celebration. At least it's a good school, my mother said, and the in-state tuition will be much more manageable. The scholarship I received for academic merit was acknowledged but not celebrated in the same way as Jessica's offers from more prestigious institutions. The message was clear: Jessica was pursuing opportunity while I was making the best of more limited options. The summer before college, Jessica worked as an intern at a regional bank, gaining experience in the business world while earning money for her education expenses. She wore professional clothes, attended client meetings, and learned about financial products and services that would serve her well in her future career. Her internship supervisor wrote a glowing recommendation letter that would strengthen her applications for competitive business school programs. I continued working at Thornfield Antiques, deepening my knowledge and building relationships with collectors and dealers who appreciated my growing expertise. Eleanor began sending me to auctions and estate sales on my own, trusting my judgment about which pieces might be worth pursuing. My success rate in identifying valuable items improved steadily as I learned to combine book knowledge with practical experience in reading markets and understanding collector preferences. But my summer of deepening expertise in antique identification wasn't the kind of preparation that translated into obvious career advantages. While Jessica's banking internship provided concrete skills and professional connections, my work at Thornfield seemed like an extension of a hobby rather than serious career preparation. The knowledge I was gaining was real and valuable, but its worth was invisible to people who measured professional development in terms of networking opportunities and resume building. As we prepared to leave for our respective colleges, the family narrative about our futures was already well established. Jessica was the daughter with unlimited potential, destined for success in whatever field she chose to pursue. Her combination of intelligence, ambition, and social skills virtually guaranteed that she would excel in business school and beyond. She was following a path that our parents understood and could proudly describe to their friends and colleagues. I was the daughter with interesting hobbies who was hopefully pursuing practical enough studies to ensure some kind of stable future. My passion for antiques and historical research was charming but probably not substantial enough to sustain a real career. The assumption was that I would eventually find my way to something more conventional, perhaps teaching or museum work that would allow me to maintain my interests while earning a steady income. Neither of our parents could have predicted that my seemingly impractical passion for old objects would eventually lead to discoveries worth more than Jessica's annual income, or that the skills I was developing in authentication and historical research would prove more valuable than the business acumen Jessica was so carefully cultivating. The tea service sitting on the auction house table represented the culmination of everything I had been learning since that first summer at Thornfield Antiques, but my family had never understood the foundation I was building or the expertise I was developing. The bidding for the Paul Revere tea service began at $20,000, and I watched from my seat in the middle section as hands rose around the auction hall with the measured confidence of serious collectors. Robert Martinez commanded the podium with the authority of decades in the business, his voice carrying clearly across the room as he acknowledged each bid with professional precision. The atmosphere was electric with the kind of focused attention that accompanied truly significant auctions when everyone present understood they were witnessing something extraordinary. Jessica sat 3 rows ahead of me with her real estate colleagues, her back rigid with attention that had nothing to do with the excitement of the auction and everything to do with the radical recalibration of everything she thought she knew about her sister. Lisa Thompson kept glancing between Jessica and me, clearly struggling to reconcile the confident woman who had mocked my purchase with the growing realization that Jessica had spectacularly misjudged the situation. The other agents in their group maintained careful neutral expressions, professional enough to recognize when a social dynamic had shifted beyond their understanding. $25,000, Robert announced, acknowledging a bid from a distinguished gentleman in the front row who I recognized as Charles Whitman, one of New England's most respected colonial furniture dealers. His participation validated everything I had hoped about the piece's significance. Whitman dealt exclusively in museum-quality American antiques, and his presence at the auction meant that serious collectors had taken notice of the tea service's authentication. The bidding climbed steadily through the 30s and into the 40s as competing collectors drove the price higher. Each raised paddle represented years of my expertise being vindicated, decades of patient study and careful authentication proving their worth in the most concrete way possible. This wasn't about family dynamics or sibling rivalry anymore. This was about the market recognizing the value of something I had identified when everyone else saw only tarnished garage sale leftovers. $50,000, Robert called out, his voice carrying a note of satisfaction as the tea service exceeded even his optimistic projections. The crowd stirred with appreciation, recognizing that they were witnessing exactly the kind of discovery that made collecting thrilling. Hidden treasures didn't reveal themselves often, and when they did, the moment carried significance that extended far beyond monetary value. I felt a tap on my shoulder and turned to see David Chen sliding into the empty seat beside me. My business partner had arrived just in time to witness the culmination of months of research and authentication work we had undertaken together. "I couldn't miss this," he whispered, his eyes bright with excitement as he watched the bidding continue. "The phone hasn't stopped ringing since word got out about the Revere piece. 3 different auction houses want to discuss future consignments." The validation from David meant more to me than the climbing bid prices. He understood the significance of what we had achieved together, the careful scholarship and methodical authentication that had transformed a $15 garage sale purchase into a discovery worthy of international attention. Our partnership had been built on exactly this kind of work, the patient expertise that could recognize extraordinary objects hiding among ordinary household goods. $60,000, Robert announced, acknowledging a bid from a woman near the back of the room, who I didn't recognize but whose confident bidding suggested serious collecting experience. The tea service was now selling for 4 times what Jessica earned in an entire year, a fact that seemed to have occurred to her as she sat frozen in her seat, no longer even pretending to follow the auction proceedings. I caught Robert's eye and gave a subtle nod of acknowledgement. As the consignor, I had the right to withdraw the piece if bidding didn't reach the reserve price we had established, but that possibility seemed increasingly remote as collectors continued to compete for ownership. The authentication certificate had done its work, establishing provenance and attribution beyond reasonable doubt. Now the market was determining what Paul Revere's artistry was worth to people who understood its historical significance. The bidding paused at $65,000 as collectors took a moment to consider whether to continue pursuing the piece. These were serious amounts of money, even for experienced collectors, and the remaining bidders were clearly calculating not just their financial capacity but their desire to own this particular example of American colonial craftsmanship. The silence stretched across the auction hall as Robert waited patiently for the next bid. $70,000, called out Charles Whitman, his voice carrying the confidence of a dealer who had built his reputation on acquiring exceptional pieces. His bid broke the tension and immediately prompted a counter-offer from the woman in the back row. The competition was now between two serious collectors who understood exactly what they were pursuing and what it was worth. David leaned closer and whispered, "The Museum of Fine Arts called this morning. They want to discuss the possibility of featuring your research in their upcoming exhibition on colonial American silver. This discovery is going to open doors you haven't even considered yet." His words carried the weight of professional recognition that extended far beyond the immediate financial success of the auction. The thought of museum recognition sent a thrill through me that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with validation from the institutions I had always respected most. Museums represented the highest level of scholarship and authentication in the antique world, and their interest in my research meant that my work was being recognized by the people whose opinions mattered most to me professionally. $75,000, Robert announced as the bidding war continued between Whitman and his competitor. The price had now reached the low end of the Sotheby's estimate, confirming that my authentication had been not only accurate but conservative. The tea service was proving to be exactly as significant as I had believed, worth every hour I had spent researching its provenance and every dollar I had invested in professional authentication. Jessica finally turned around to look at me, her expression unreadable but clearly shaken by the magnitude of what she was witnessing. The sister she had dismissed as a dreamer with expensive hobbies was sitting behind her watching a piece she had identified sell for more money than most people earned in several years. The reversal was so complete that she seemed unable to process it fully, her earlier confidence replaced by something approaching shock. I met her gaze calmly, without triumph or satisfaction, just the steady acknowledgement of someone whose expertise had been vindicated in the most public way possible. This wasn't about proving Jessica wrong or seeking revenge for years of dismissive comments. This was about claiming the recognition I had earned through patient scholarship and careful work, validation that came not from family approval but from the market's objective assessment of value. $80,000, the woman in the back row called out, her voice carrying across the suddenly quiet auction hall. The bid represented a significant escalation, pushing the tea service well into the upper range of the Sotheby's estimate, and confirming that serious collectors recognized its exceptional quality and historical importance. Robert paused dramatically, his experienced auctioneer's instincts recognizing the moment's significance. "I have $80,000 for this exceptional example of Paul Revere's silver work. Do I hear 85? His question hung in the air as Charles Whitman considered whether to continue pursuing the piece at this elevated price level. The silence stretched for several seconds before Whitman shook his head slightly, acknowledging that he had reached his limit. The woman in the back row had successfully claimed ownership of the tea service, and Robert's gavel came down with finality. "Sold for $80,000 to bidder number 47. The applause that followed was genuine and sustained, recognition from fellow collectors of both the piece's significance and the successful conclusion of competitive bidding. I felt a complex mixture of emotions as the reality of what had just happened settled over me. The tea service that Jessica had mocked as worthless garage sale junk had just sold for $80,000, validating not only my authentication skills but the entire foundation of expertise I had been building for years. The financial success was gratifying, but the professional recognition meant even more. David squeezed my shoulder as the crowd began to disperse, many people approaching the display table to get a closer look at the piece that had commanded such impressive bidding. "This is just the beginning," he said quietly. "Word about discoveries like this travels fast in the collecting world. We're going to have opportunities we never imagined." As people filed past our seats, heading toward the reception area, several stopped to congratulate me on the successful sale. These weren't casual compliments, but serious acknowledgments from fellow professionals who understood the scholarship and expertise required for this kind of discovery. Tom Bradley, a longtime antique dealer I had worked with on several authentication projects, paused to shake my hand. "Emma, that was extraordinary work," he said with genuine respect. "The research you provided was impeccable, and the market response proves you got everything right. This is the kind of discovery that establishes reputations." His words carried weight in the antique community, and I knew that news of the successful authentication would spread quickly among serious dealers and collectors. Jessica remained in her seat as the auction hall emptied around her, clearly struggling to process what she had witnessed. Her colleagues had already departed for the reception, leaving her alone with the magnitude of her miscalculation. The confident woman who had publicly dismissed her sister's expertise just hours earlier was now confronting the reality that she had spectacularly misjudged both the situation and the person she thought she knew so well. I gathered my things slowly, in no hurry to force a confrontation but knowing that Jessica and I would need to address what had happened. The auction had changed something fundamental in our relationship, shifting the balance of assumptions and expectations that had governed our interactions for decades. The quiet sister who collected old junk had just demonstrated expertise worth far more than anything Jessica had achieved in her successful real estate career.
David accompanied me toward the reception area, where Robert Martinez was already fielding questions from collectors interested in future consignments. The success of the Paul Revere authentication had elevated the auction house's reputation and my own, creating opportunities that extended far beyond this single discovery. Museums, dealers, and private collectors would now view my work with the kind of respect I had been building toward for years. "Emma," Jessica called softly as I passed her row. I turned to find her looking smaller somehow, diminished by the realization that everything she thought she understood about success and expertise had been challenged by someone she had consistently underestimated. Her earlier confidence had evaporated, replaced by uncertainty about how to navigate this new dynamic between us. "Can we talk?" she asked, her voice lacking the commanding tone she usually employed. The woman who had always controlled conversations and social situations was now requesting rather than assuming my attention. The shift in power dynamics was subtle but unmistakable, reflecting the broader recalibration that would be necessary as our family processed what had happened. I nodded toward a quiet corner of the auction hall where we could speak privately, away from the lingering crowd and the ongoing reception activities. Jessica followed me with uncharacteristic hesitancy, clearly uncertain about how to begin a conversation that would require acknowledging how wrong she had been about my capabilities and achievements. "I don't understand," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "How did you know? How could something that looked so ordinary be worth so much money?" Her questions revealed the depth of her confusion about the expertise I had been developing while she focused on her own more visible career success. I looked at my sister with something approaching sympathy, recognizing that her shock was genuine and that this moment represented a fundamental challenge to her understanding of how value and expertise worked. Jessica had built her success on reading people and markets in ways that were immediately apparent, while my work required the kind of deep knowledge that wasn't visible to casual observers. "I've been learning about this for 15 years, I said gently. "Since that first summer at Thornfield Antiques when I was 18, every piece I've studied, every auction I've attended, every dealer I've worked with has taught me something about recognizing quality and historical significance. The tea service looked ordinary to most people because they don't know what to look for. Jessica stared at me as if seeing a stranger, struggling to reconcile the sister she thought she knew with the expert who had just orchestrated an $80,000 sale. But you never said anything. You never told anyone in the family that you were capable of something like this. Her voice carried a note of accusation, as if my quiet competence had somehow been a betrayal of family transparency. You never asked, I replied, echoing the same response I had given years earlier when our paths first began to diverge. Every time I tried to share what I was learning or what I was working on, the conversation shifted to your achievements or your latest success. I stopped trying to explain my world because no one seemed interested in understanding it. The truth of that statement hung between us like a bridge neither of us had been willing to cross for years. Jessica's success had been so visible and immediate that it had overshadowed everything else happening in our family, creating a dynamic where only certain kinds of achievement were recognized or valued. My quieter path had been dismissed as less significant simply because it was less obvious. I thought you were just collecting old things as a hobby, Jessica said, her voice small and uncertain. I didn't realize you were building something real, something valuable. Mom and Dad always talked about your antique interest like it was something you'd eventually outgrow. I felt a familiar sadness at the recognition that our parents had never understood what I was building, had never seen the expertise I was developing as anything more than an interesting pastime. Their focus on Jessica's more conventional success had blinded them to the possibility that different kinds of achievement might be equally valid or valuable. What happens now? Jessica asked, and I could hear genuine uncertainty in her voice about how our relationship would need to change in light of what had been revealed. The assumptions that had governed our family dynamics for decades had been shattered by the auction, and none of us quite knew how to navigate the new reality. Now you go back to your work, and I go back to mine, I said, borrowing language from the original story but making it my own. Maybe next time we talk, it'll be as people who understand that success comes in many different forms, and that expertise isn't always immediately visible to people who don't share the same knowledge. Jessica nodded slowly, seeming to understand that this conversation was an ending of sorts, the conclusion of years of misunderstanding and misplaced assumptions. The sister who had always been confident about her place in the world was now grappling with the realization that she had never really understood mine. I left her sitting in the auction hall and walked toward the reception area, where David was already discussing future projects with Robert Martinez and several dealers who had attended the sale. The success of the Paul Revere authentication had opened doors I was only beginning to understand, creating opportunities for the kind of work I had always dreamed of doing. 3 months later, Jessica sent me a text message that simply said, "I saw the article about your museum exhibition. Congratulations. I'm proud of you." It was the first time she had ever acknowledged my professional achievements without qualification or comparison to her own success. I didn't reply immediately, not out of spite, but because I didn't need anything more from her than that simple recognition. The Museum of Fine Arts exhibition, featuring my research, ran for 6 months and established my reputation among serious collectors and institutions across the country. The $15 garage sale purchase had become not just a financial success, but a foundation for the kind of scholarly recognition I had been working towards since that first summer at Thornfield Antiques. I never told my parents the exact details of how I had acquired the tea service or what I had paid for it at that garage sale in Willowbrook Estates. They read about the auction in the local newspaper and called to offer congratulations, but their understanding of what had happened remained limited by their focus on the financial aspects rather than the scholarly achievement the discovery represented. 6 months after the auction, I used part of the proceeds to open a proper gallery space for Collins and Chen appraisals, moving out of the cramped office above the bookstore and into a restored Victorian house that could properly display the quality pieces we were now being asked to authenticate. David and I hired 2 additional researchers and began offering educational seminars for collectors who wanted to develop their own expertise in American decorative arts. The quiet expertise I had been building in the shadows had finally found its proper recognition, not through family approval or social validation, but through the respect of people who understood what scholarship and authentication required. The girl who had been dismissed as a dreamer with expensive hobbies had built something substantial and lasting, something that would continue growing long after the immediate excitement of the auction had faded. I still attend estate sales and auctions, still feel the thrill of discovering quality pieces among objects others have overlooked. But now I carry the confidence that comes from proven expertise, the knowledge that my eye for value and historical significance has been validated by the market and recognized by institutions that represent the highest standards in the field. The Paul Revere Tea Service now sits in a private collection where it is properly appreciated and preserved, but its real legacy was the demonstration that extraordinary discoveries are still possible for people who combine knowledge with passion and patience. Sometimes the most valuable treasures are hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone with the expertise to recognize what everyone else has missed. Jessica and I speak occasionally now, our conversations marked by a mutual respect that was missing for so many years. She has never asked me to explain exactly how I knew the tea service was valuable, seeming to understand that the answer would require a depth of knowledge she doesn't possess and isn't particularly interested in acquiring. We have found a way to appreciate each other's achievements without needing to understand the details of how they were accomplished. The auction hall where my life changed now hosts monthly sales, featuring everything from estate jewelry to contemporary art, but I still remember the moment when Robert Martinez announced my name, and everything I had been building in silence finally stepped into the light. Not everyone needs a spotlight to build something meaningful, but sometimes the light finds you anyway, revealing work that was always valuable, even when it wasn't visible to the people who should have been paying attention. The months following my graduation from college marked the beginning of what I would later recognize as the most formative period of my professional development. While Jessica launched immediately into real estate success with premier properties, I found myself navigating the uncertain terrain of building expertise in a field that most people didn't understand or value. My art history degree had provided a solid foundation in American decorative arts, but the practical knowledge of authentication and market evaluation could only be learned through hands-on experience with actual pieces and real collectors. Eleanor Hartley welcomed me back to Thornfield Antiques with the offer of a full-time position that paid barely above minimum wage, but provided access to an education worth far more than the modest salary suggested. She had watched my development during those crucial teenage years and understood that my passion for antiques represented more than casual interest. Eleanor recognized in me the same dedication to scholarship and quality that had driven her own 4-decade career in the field. The antique business rewards patience and punishes impatience, Eleanor told me during my first week back at the shop. People who expect quick profits or easy answers don't last long. But those who understand that every piece tells a story, and that learning to read those stories takes years of careful study, can build something lasting. Her words proved prophetic as I began the slow process of developing the kind of expertise that would eventually enable me to recognize a Paul Revere tea service at a garage sale. My work at Thornfield involved every aspect of the antique business, from researching provenance and authentication to dealing with collectors who ranged from knowledgeable enthusiasts to wealthy dilettantes who bought expensive pieces without understanding what made them valuable. Eleanor taught me to navigate these different types of clients while maintaining the integrity that separated serious dealers from mere merchants of old objects. The education I received working alongside Eleanor was comprehensive and demanding. I learned to identify different types of wood by examining grain patterns and construction techniques to spot the subtle differences between period pieces and later reproductions, and to research makers' marks using reference materials that Eleanor had been collecting for decades. Most importantly, I learned to trust my instincts while backing them up with rigorous research and documentation. One of my most significant early discoveries came during an estate sale in Fairfield County, where a prominent family was dispersing the accumulated possessions of 3 generations. Eleanor had sent me to evaluate the potential of the sale based on newspaper advertisements that suggested quality furniture and decorative objects. The house was magnificent, a colonial revival mansion filled with the kind of formal pieces that spoke to inherited wealth and refined taste. Most of the obvious treasures had already been claimed by established dealers who had early access to the sale, but I had learned from Eleanor that the most interesting discoveries often came from careful examination of pieces that others had overlooked. I spent hours methodically going through rooms that had been largely picked over, looking for items that might have been misidentified or undervalued. In a third-floor bedroom that seemed to have been used for storage, I found a collection of furniture that had been relegated to secondary status by the family and most of the dealers who had already combed through the house. Among these pieces was a chest of drawers that looked unremarkable at first glance, its original finish obscured by later paint, and its hardware replaced with modern pulls that detracted from any historical appeal it might have possessed. But something about the proportions and construction details caught my attention as I examined the piece more carefully. The dovetail joints were hand-cut with the kind of precision that suggested 18th-century craftsmanship, and the wood underneath the paint felt like old-growth pine with the density that characterized period construction. When I removed one of the modern pulls, I discovered that the original brass hardware had simply been painted over, not replaced. Eleanor had taught me to look beyond surface appearance to understand underlying construction and design elements. I spent nearly an hour examining the chest from every angle, taking note of details that suggested it might be a significant American piece that had been dismissed because of its poor condition and later modifications. The proportions were exactly right for Connecticut River Valley work from the 1760s or 1770s, and the construction techniques matched what I had studied in my decorative arts courses. The asking price was $300, which reflected the family's assessment of the piece as damaged goods, suitable only for someone willing to undertake extensive restoration work. But if my instincts were correct about the chest's origins and period, it could be worth 20 times that amount once properly restored and authenticated. I purchased the piece along with several other items that Eleanor had asked me to evaluate, loading everything into the shop's delivery van for transport back to Thornfield. The restoration process took nearly 6 months of careful work, slowly removing layers of paint to reveal the original finish underneath, while documenting every detail that supported my theory about the chest's provenance. Eleanor supervised the work with the kind of patient attention that had made her reputation in the field, teaching me to balance historical preservation with the practical requirements of making pieces appealing to contemporary collectors. As the restoration progressed, the chest revealed itself to be exactly what I had hoped, a superb example of Connecticut River Valley cabinet making from around 1765, with original brass hardware and a rich cherry finish that had been preserved beneath decades of paint. The construction details matched documented examples from the Chapin and Gould workshops, though without maker's marks, it would be impossible to attribute the piece to specific craftsmen. Eleanor was delighted with both the discovery and my developing eye for quality pieces. This is exactly the kind of work that separates real dealers from furniture sellers, she said as we prepared the chest for sale. Anyone can buy and sell obvious antiques, but finding quality in unexpected places requires knowledge that most people don't possess. The chest eventually sold to a collector specializing in American furniture for $12,000, validating both my authentication and Eleanor's faith in my developing expertise. The success of the Connecticut chest discovery gave me confidence to trust my instincts while continuing to back them up with thorough research and documentation. Eleanor began sending me to auctions and estate sales on my own, knowing that I could identify pieces worth pursuing while avoiding the expensive mistakes that trapped less experienced buyers. Each successful discovery built upon the last, creating a foundation of practical knowledge that complemented my academic training. By my second year at Thornfield, I was handling authentication projects for other dealers and private collectors who respected Eleanor's judgment and trusted her recommendations. This work involved everything from researching provenance for insurance purposes to identifying pieces that might be suitable for museum collections. Each project required a different combination of historical knowledge, technical expertise, and detective work that challenged me to expand my understanding of American decorative arts. The network of relationships I was building extended far beyond Cedar Falls to include collectors, dealers, and museum professionals throughout New England and beyond. These connections were based on professional respect rather than social networking, founded on demonstrated expertise rather than personal charm. I was developing a reputation for thorough research and accurate authentication that would serve as the foundation for everything I would accomplish in the years ahead. Meanwhile, Jessica's real estate career was flourishing in ways that were immediately visible and easy for our family to understand and celebrate. She had quickly established herself as one of the most successful agents at Premier Properties, earning recognition for her sales volume and her ability to work with high-end clients who appreciated her combination of market knowledge and social skills. Her success was measured in concrete terms that translated easily into family pride and community recognition. The contrast between our career paths became more pronounced as Jessica's achievements were regularly featured in local business publications, while my work remained largely invisible to people outside the antique collecting community. Jessica sold houses that everyone could see and understand, while I authenticated pieces whose significance was apparent only to people with specialized knowledge. Her success generated immediate financial rewards and public recognition, while mine built slowly through professional relationships and scholarly reputation. Our parents' response to our different achievements reflected their understanding of what constituted real success and substantial accomplishment. Jessica's real estate awards and sales figures were concrete evidence of professional achievement that they could proudly share with friends and relatives. My growing expertise in American decorative arts was more difficult to explain and seemed less substantial to people who measured success in terms of immediate financial results and visible recognition. Family gatherings during this period followed predictable patterns, with Jessica's latest triumphs dominating conversations while my work was politely acknowledged but quickly passed over. I learned to smile and nod when relatives asked about my antique hobby, understanding that they genuinely couldn't grasp the difference between casual collecting and serious professional expertise. The assumption seemed to be that I was marking time in an interesting but ultimately peripheral field, while Jessica was building real career success. The irony was that I was developing skills and knowledge that would eventually prove more valuable than anything Jessica was accomplishing in real estate. But the worth of my expertise wasn't apparent to people who didn't understand the antique market or the scholarly requirements of authentication work. Eleanor understood what I was building and encouraged my development, but her validation didn't carry weight with family members who measured achievement in terms they could easily comprehend. 3 years into my work at Thornfield, Eleanor began discussing the possibility of my eventually taking over the business when she retired. She was approaching 75 and had been considering how to ensure that the shop would continue to maintain the standards of scholarship and integrity that had defined her career. The prospect of inheriting Thornfield represented both an enormous opportunity and a tremendous responsibility that would require me to prove myself capable of maintaining Eleanor's reputation while building my own. The transition process began gradually, with Eleanor giving me increasing responsibility for major purchases and authentication projects, while maintaining oversight of the shop's operations and client relationships. I was essentially apprenticing for ownership of a business that represented 4 decades of careful reputation building, learning not just the technical aspects of dealing in antiques, but the relationship management and ethical considerations that separated respected dealers from mere merchants. During this period, I met David Chen at an estate auction in Hartford, where we found ourselves bidding against each other for a collection of Chinese export porcelain that had caught both our attention. David was a few years older than me, with a graduate degree in art history from Yale and specialized knowledge of Asian decorative arts that complemented my expertise in American pieces. After the auction, we spent several hours discussing the porcelain collection and discovered a shared approach to authentication that emphasized scholarly research over market trends. David was working as an independent appraiser, building a client base among collectors and institutions who needed expert evaluation of Asian art and decorative objects. His background was similar to mine, in that he had chosen to pursue expertise in a specialized field that required years of study and practical experience to master properly. We began collaborating on projects that involved both American and Asian pieces, combining our knowledge to provide more comprehensive authentication services. The partnership that developed between David and me represented exactly the kind of professional relationship that Eleanor had always encouraged. We shared a commitment to rigorous research and accurate authentication that put scholarly integrity ahead of immediate financial considerations. Our collaboration allowed us to handle more complex projects while maintaining the standards that had defined both our individual careers. By the time Eleanor was ready to retire, David and I had established Collins and Chen Appraisals as a partnership that could take over Thornfield's client relationships while expanding into new areas of expertise. Eleanor sold us the business at a price that reflected her desire to see her life's work continue, rather than simply maximize her retirement proceeds. The transition preserved everything that had made Thornfield special, while allowing us to build something that reflected our own vision for what an antique business could accomplish. The success of our partnership was built on the foundation of expertise and professional relationships that I had been developing since that first summer working for Eleanor. We were able to handle authentication projects for major auction houses, provide consulting services for museums and private collectors, and discover significant pieces that others had overlooked. Our reputation grew through word-of-mouth recommendations from satisfied clients rather than advertising or marketing campaigns. One of our most significant early discoveries as partners came through a client who had inherited a house full of furniture from a great-aunt who had lived in Boston her entire life. The family was preparing to sell everything through an estate sale company, but they wanted our opinion about whether any pieces might be particularly valuable before they committed to that course of action. This was exactly the kind of project that Eleanor had taught me to approach with careful attention to detail and thorough research.
The house was filled with furniture and decorative objects that reflected several generations of accumulated possessions, much of it good quality, but not exceptional enough to command significant prices in the current market. David and I spent an entire day methodically examining everything, taking notes and photographs of pieces that showed particular promise or unusual characteristics. Most of what we found was respectable, but not remarkable, the kind of inherited furniture that filled estate sales throughout New England. But in the dining room, sitting on a sideboard among some unremarkable serving pieces, was a silver tea service that immediately caught my attention. The pieces were heavily tarnished, their elegant lines obscured by decades of neglect, but something about their proportions and weight suggested quality far superior to typical Victorian silverware. The construction details were exactly right for late 18th century American work, and when I examined the maker's marks more carefully, I felt the familiar thrill of potential discovery. The marks were partially obscured by tarnish, but I could make out enough detail to suggest attribution to one of the major American silversmiths of the colonial period. David helped me document every aspect of the tea service, while we explained to the family that proper authentication would require several months of research and expert consultation. They agreed to let us handle the authentication process, understanding that significant pieces required professional evaluation before they could be properly valued. The research process that followed was exhaustive and methodical, involving everything from microscopic examination of construction details to archival research into the working methods of specific silversmiths. I contacted experts at major museums and auction houses, providing detailed photographs and measurements while building the documentation necessary for definitive attribution. The work was painstaking but exhilarating, representing exactly the kind of scholarly detective work that had drawn me to the antique field. When the authentication was complete, and I held the official certificate documenting the tea service as an authentic Paul Revere piece, with clear provenance and museum-quality condition, I knew that I had achieved something that would define the rest of my career. This wasn't just about the financial value of the discovery, though that was certainly significant. This was about proving that the expertise I had been building for years could recognize extraordinary quality, even when it was hidden among ordinary household goods. The family was stunned by the authentication results, having had no idea that they owned anything of such historical and monetary significance. They decided to consign the tea service to auction rather than sell it privately, wanting to ensure that it would be offered to the collecting community with full documentation and appropriate publicity. The decision to use the Cedar Falls charity auction as the venue was mine, motivated by a desire to bring this level of discovery to our local community while supporting the Historical Society's preservation efforts.
Never anticipated that Jessica would be at the auction, or that she would see the tea service and immediately assume it was another example of my expensive hobby rather than a professional discovery worth more than she earned in an entire year. Her public mockery of my purchase was the culmination of decades of misunderstanding about what I was actually doing and what level of expertise I had achieved, while she focused on her own more visible career success. But as I sat in that auction hall watching the bidding climb toward levels that validated everything I had worked for, I realized that this moment was about more than family dynamics or professional recognition. This was about the difference between surface appearance and deeper understanding, between immediate judgment and careful evaluation. The people bidding on the tea service understood that extraordinary quality could be hidden in unexpected places, waiting for someone with the knowledge and patience to recognize its true significance. The auction represented not just the culmination of months of authentication work, but the vindication of everything I had been building since that first summer at Thornfield Antiques. The quiet expertise I had developed, while others pursued more obvious forms of success, had finally found its moment of recognition, proving that different paths could lead to achievements that were equally valuable, even if they weren't immediately apparent to casual observers. As the gavel came down and the tea service sold for a price that exceeded even my optimistic projections, I understood that this discovery would transform not just my professional reputation, but my family's understanding of what I had been accomplishing all along. The girl who collected old junk had just demonstrated expertise that commanded respect from the most serious collectors and institutions in the field. The success of the Paul Revere authentication opened doors that I had only dreamed about, leading to consulting opportunities with major museums and auction houses that recognized the level of scholarship and expertise required for such discoveries. David and I found ourselves handling authentication projects for some of the most significant private collections in the country, building a business that combined scholarly integrity with practical knowledge of markets and collector preferences. Most importantly, the discovery proved that extraordinary treasures were still waiting to be found by people who combine knowledge with passion and patience. The antique world rewards those who understand that value isn't always immediately apparent, that the most significant discoveries often come from looking more carefully at things others have dismissed or overlooked. Sometimes the greatest treasures are hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone with the expertise to recognize what everyone else has missed. The transformation in my professional life following the Paul Revere authentication was both immediate and profound, opening pathways I had never imagined possible during those early years of quietly building expertise in the shadows of Jessica's more visible success. Within weeks of the auction, my phone began ringing with inquiries from collectors, dealers, and institutions who had heard about the discovery and wanted to discuss potential projects. The antique world, despite its size and scope, operated much like a small community where news of significant finds traveled quickly among people who understood their importance. Dr. Margaret Whitfield from the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston was among the first to contact me, her call coming just 3 days after the auction results were published in the trade publications. Dr. Whitfield served as the museum's curator of American decorative arts, and her reputation in the field was legendary among serious collectors and scholars. The fact that she was personally reaching out to discuss my research represented a level of professional recognition that validated everything I had worked toward since those first summers at Thornfield Antiques. Miss Collins, Dr. Whitfield said during our initial conversation, "Your authentication work on the Revere tea service has been exemplary. The documentation you provided demonstrates exactly the kind of rigorous scholarship that our field requires. We would be very interested in discussing the possibility of featuring your research in our upcoming exhibition on colonial American silver." Her words carried weight that extended far beyond mere compliment, representing acknowledgement from one of the most respected institutions in American decorative arts. The exhibition opportunity Dr. Whitfield described would involve not just displaying the tea service itself, but presenting the research methodology and historical context that had enabled its identification and authentication. This meant that visitors to the Museum of Fine Arts would learn about the detective work involved in recognizing quality pieces, understanding the scholarly foundation that separated reliable attribution from educated guesswork. For someone who had spent years working in relative obscurity, the prospect of having my research featured in such a prestigious venue was both thrilling and somewhat overwhelming. David Chen and I spent the following months preparing materials for the museum exhibition while simultaneously fielding inquiries from other institutions and collectors who wanted to discuss potential projects. The Smithsonian Institution expressed interest in having us consult on their American decorative arts collection, while several major auction houses reached out about authentication services for upcoming sales.
Each opportunity represented validation of the expertise we had been building together, confirmation that our approach to rigorous research and careful documentation met the highest professional standards. The work involved in preparing for the museum exhibition required me to articulate not just what I had discovered about the tea service, but how I had made that discovery. Dr. Whitfield and her team wanted visitors to understand the process of authentication, the way that careful observation combined with historical research to enable identification of significant pieces. This meant explaining everything from the technical details of silversmithing techniques to the broader historical context that made Paul Revere's work so important to American decorative arts. Writing the exhibition materials forced me to reflect on the journey that had led to this moment, tracing the development of expertise from those early days working with Eleanor Hartley through the years of building relationships with dealers and collectors who had taught me to see quality in unexpected places. Each step had built upon the previous one, creating a foundation of knowledge that enabled me to recognize the tea service's significance when others saw only tarnished household goods. The exhibition opening at the Museum of Fine Arts was attended by collectors, dealers, scholars, and museum professionals from across the country, creating an atmosphere of serious appreciation for American decorative arts that represented everything I had always loved about the field. Standing in the gallery, watching visitors examine the tea service and read about the research that had led to its authentication, I felt a profound sense of accomplishment that had nothing to do with financial success and everything to do with contributing something meaningful to the understanding of American craftsmanship. Jessica attended the exhibition opening, flying up from Connecticut specifically to see the display that featured her sister's work. I spotted her across the gallery, looking elegant but somewhat out of place among the collectors and scholars who comprised most of the evening's attendance. She spent a long time reading the wall text that described my research methodology, clearly trying to understand the depth of knowledge and expertise that the discovery had required. When she approached me later in the evening, Jessica's expression was thoughtful rather than shocked, as if she had finally begun to process what my work actually involved and what level of recognition it had achieved. "Emma," she said quietly, "I had no idea that what you were doing was so sophisticated, so scholarly. The way they've presented your research here makes it clear that you're not just dealing in antiques, you're contributing to historical knowledge." Her acknowledgement meant more to me than I had expected, not because I needed Jessica's approval, but because it represented recognition from someone who had never understood what I was building. The sister who had dismissed my work as an expensive hobby was beginning to grasp that authentication and historical research required expertise that took years to develop and commanded respect from institutions that represented the highest standards in the field. "I should have asked more questions," Jessica continued, her voice carrying a note of regret that surprised me. "I should have tried to understand what you were actually doing instead of assuming it was just collecting old things. This exhibition makes it clear that your work is as sophisticated as anything I've accomplished in real estate, just in a field I didn't understand." The conversation with Jessica at the museum represented a turning point in our relationship, though not the dramatic reconciliation that might be expected in a simpler story. We didn't suddenly become close friends or confidants, but we developed a mutual respect based on acknowledgement of each other's expertise and achievements. Jessica had finally understood that success could take many different forms, while I had learned to appreciate her accomplishments without feeling diminished by their visibility. The months following the museum exhibition brought a steady stream of opportunities that established Collins & Chen Appraisals as one of the most respected authentication services in the field. Major auction houses began consulting us regularly on American and Asian decorative arts, while private collectors sought our expertise for insurance valuations and acquisition advice. Each project built upon our growing reputation for thorough research and accurate attribution, creating a business that combined scholarly integrity with practical knowledge of markets and collector preferences. One of our most significant projects during this period involved consulting for the Metropolitan Museum of Art on their acquisition of a major collection of American furniture and decorative arts. The collection had been assembled over several decades by a private collector who had died without leaving detailed documentation about provenance and attribution. The museum needed comprehensive authentication of more than 200 pieces before they could be accessioned into the permanent collection. The project required 6 months of intensive research, with David and I working alongside museum curators and conservation specialists to examine every piece in detail. Each object had to be photographed, measured, and compared against documented examples in museum collections and auction records. The work was meticulous and demanding, but it represented exactly the kind of scholarly collaboration that had drawn me to the field originally. During the authentication process, we discovered that several pieces in the collection were significantly more important than had been previously understood. A chest-on-chest that had been attributed to a New England workshop was actually the work of a documented Philadelphia cabinet maker whose pieces were extremely rare. A set of chairs that had been considered good examples of regional craftsmanship proved to be early work by a major American furniture maker whose later pieces commanded six-figure prices at auction. These discoveries within the Metropolitan's acquisition demonstrated the ongoing importance of careful authentication work, the way that new research and scholarship could reveal significance that had been previously overlooked. Each authentication required combining technical knowledge of construction techniques with historical research into makers' marks, stylistic development, and documentary evidence. The work was challenging but deeply satisfying, representing the kind of contribution to knowledge that had always motivated my interest in American decorative arts. The success of the Metropolitan project led to similar consulting opportunities with other major museums, establishing David and me as specialists who could handle the most demanding authentication challenges. We were invited to lecture at professional conferences, contribute to scholarly publications, and serve on expert panels that evaluated pieces for insurance and legal purposes. Each opportunity reinforced our reputation while expanding our knowledge through exposure to collections and objects we might never have encountered otherwise. By the third anniversary of the Paul Revere discovery, Collins and Chen Appraisals had grown from a two-person partnership operating out of the space above Eleanor's old bookstore to a respected firm with offices in a restored Victorian mansion and a staff that included 2 additional researchers and a conservation specialist. We had maintained the scholarly approach that Eleanor Hartley had instilled in me while building a business that could handle projects of national significance. The financial success of the business was gratifying, but more important was the recognition that we had achieved something meaningful in our chosen field. The authentication services we provided helped ensure that significant pieces of American decorative arts were properly identified and preserved, while our research contributed to the broader understanding of American craftsmanship and design history. We had built something that would continue growing and contributing long after our individual careers had ended. My parents eventually came to understand, at least partially, what I had accomplished through years of patient work in a field they had never fully appreciated. The museum exhibitions and scholarly publications made my achievements more visible and comprehensible to people outside the antique community, though they remain somewhat mystified by the level of expertise required for accurate authentication. Their pride in my success was genuine but tinged with surprise, as if they had never expected their quiet daughter to achieve recognition in any field. The relationship between Jessica and me evolved into something that resembled genuine friendship, built on mutual respect rather than family obligation. She had expanded her real estate business into commercial properties and historic preservation projects, work that sometimes brought her into contact with people who knew about my authentication services. These crossover moments created opportunities for us to appreciate each other's expertise without the competitive dynamic that had characterized our earlier relationship. 5 years after the auction that changed everything, Jessica called to tell me about a potential project that might interest me. She was representing the estate of a family whose historic house was being sold along with its contents, and the attorneys handling the estate wanted professional authentication of the decorative arts before determining how to dispose of them.
It was exactly the kind of referral that demonstrated how much our relationship had changed, with Jessica recognizing and respecting my expertise rather than dismissing it. The estate project led to several significant discoveries, including a documented piece of Newport furniture that had been attributed to the Goddard and Townsend workshops. The authentication process required months of research and consultation with museum curators, but the eventual attribution confirmed that the piece was indeed the work of one of America's most celebrated cabinet-making families. The discovery generated enough publicity to establish our firm's reputation on a national level, leading to authentication requests from collectors and institutions across the country. The success of our business allowed David and me to give back to the field that had given us so much opportunity. We established a scholarship fund for graduate students studying American decorative arts, providing support for the kind of scholarly research that formed the foundation of reliable authentication. We also began offering workshops for collectors and dealers who wanted to develop their own expertise in identifying quality pieces and understanding historical significance. Teaching others about authentication and historical research proved to be deeply satisfying, allowing us to share the knowledge and passion that had driven our own careers while contributing to the next generation of experts in the field. Each workshop participant who learned to recognize quality craftsmanship or understand historical context represented a small victory for the kind of careful scholarship that Eleanor Hartley had instilled in me years earlier. The antique business continued to evolve with changing technology and market conditions, but the fundamental requirements of expertise and integrity remained constant. New tools for research and documentation made some aspects of authentication easier, while global markets created opportunities for discoveries that previous generations of dealers could never have imagined. Through all these changes, the essential work of recognizing quality and understanding historical significance remained as challenging and rewarding as ever. Looking back on the journey from that first summer at Thornfield Antiques to the establishment of Collins & Chen Appraisals as a nationally recognized authentication service, I understood that every step had been necessary preparation for what came next. The patient development of expertise, the relationships built with mentors and colleagues, the willingness to trust my instincts while backing them up with rigorous research, all had contributed to creating the foundation that enabled me to recognize the Paul Revere tea service when everyone else saw only garage sale leftovers. The auction where Jessica mocked my purchase had been a watershed moment, but not because it provided revenge or vindication against family members who had underestimated my achievements. Instead, it had been the moment when years of quiet work finally found public recognition, when the expertise I had been building in the shadows finally stepped into the light where it could be properly appreciated and utilized. The tea service itself now resided in a private collection where it was treasured and properly preserved, but its real legacy was the demonstration that extraordinary discoveries remained possible for people who combined knowledge with passion and patience. The antique world continued to reward those who understood that value wasn't always immediately apparent, that the most significant finds often came from looking more carefully at things others had dismissed or overlooked. Jessica and I still saw each other regularly at family gatherings and social events, our conversations now marked by genuine interest in each other's work rather than polite obligation. She had learned to ask thoughtful questions about my latest projects, while I had developed appreciation for the skills required to succeed in her chosen field. We had both discovered that expertise could take many different forms, each valuable in its own way and deserving of respect from people who might not share the same knowledge or interests. The quiet satisfaction I felt watching new collectors discover their first significant pieces reminded me of my own early experiences at Thornfield Antiques, when Eleanor Hartley had patiently taught me to see beyond surface appearance to understand deeper significance. Each successful authentication, each properly preserved piece of American craftsmanship, each new expert trained in reliable research methods, represented a small contribution to the preservation of knowledge and appreciation for the objects that connected us to our historical heritage. The girl who had once been dismissed as a dreamer with expensive hobbies had built something lasting and meaningful, something that would continue contributing long after the immediate excitement of individual discoveries had faded. Not everyone needs a spotlight to create value, but sometimes the light finds you anyway, revealing work that was always significant even when it wasn't visible to people who should have been paying closer attention. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.